and we had discussed the fact that real estate was not deemed an essential business on a state level. And it may have been on a county level or even in certain cities on a city level, but that it was not on a state level. So if I could pause, Nikki, is the gardener really loud? Are you guys able to hear me?
Yeah, I don't even hear that, so I think you're good.
Oh, great, because that's all I hear. Okay.
No, you're good.
Good. So one of the things we have to keep in mind is our civics class from high school. If you remember back to when you took government, hopefully it was still in your school at the time, we have to follow the larger law of the land, so to speak. So we follow the city, which must follow the county, which must follow the state, which then must also follow the federal government's guidelines. So if the city or the county are more broad, for example, than the state, we have to follow the state. I know this is very odd, but I can't think because it's so loud over here. So if you guys can hold on, and this is very odd, hang on about 30 seconds. I'm going to try and get the gardener to back off right outside my window. So hold on.
Okay. Sorry, guys.
Thanks, guys. Sorry about that. So, so one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that we have to follow the highest level of law. That's going to come from the federal government, from there the state, then it's going to be your county, and then it's going to be your city. So what's happened since we last talked on this webinar? What's happened is real estate has been deemed an essential business. Who has it been deemed an essential business by? That's really important to understand in order to figure out what that means for your daily practice. When the governor of California, Governor Newsom, put in place the stay-at-home order, he pointed to a set of federal standards for what constitutes an essential business. So the federal guidelines were what were telling all of us here in California what is an essential business. When Governor Newsom put that order in place over a week ago, real estate was not included in that. Then on March 28th, the federal guidelines were changed. They included real estate sales, both residential and commercial, as well as settlement services, which is what we know as escrow. So those were both included in the federal guidelines. The federal guidelines tell us what the state is going to require, because remember, Governor Newsom said the state will follow the federal guidelines. So as soon as real estate sales were included in the federal guidelines for essential businesses, all of a sudden they were included into California's guideline for essential businesses. So that's what happened on the 28th. That means that in California, real estate, both residential and commercial, are deemed essential. So what if your city has a restriction that does not include real estate as an essential service? Then within that city, you are not an essential service. The reason is because the larger forms of government, the higher forms of government, the state can set standards. And then from there, counties and cities can be more restrictive. They just can't be less restrictive. So California has a broad definition for us as real estate professionals, but the County of Los Angeles also includes the definition for real estate professionals. The City of Los Angeles, for example, does not include real estate professionals on their essential business list. Now, I know that can change at any moment. In fact, it could have changed between the time I looked it up yesterday and when I'm talking to you today. So if that's changed, please keep apprised of it. But the most important thing to remember is you must check in the city that you're working with whether or not you're deemed an essential business. Why is that important? It's important for a couple of reasons. If you are an essential business, then you're allowed to leave your home in order to conduct business only if necessary. You have to still maintain all the proper distances. CAR put out a great guideline of how to sell real estate, and it talks a lot about, maintaining 6 feet, making sure that there's only you know, a person in the property at the time, no more than 2 people meeting. And it goes through a set of guidelines that's really helpful if you're going to be outside of your home conducting business. But if that city has said that you are not an essential business, then you're not allowed to conduct business outside of your home. Everything is required to be virtual. So one of the things I do also want to point out is, even though we've been deemed an essential business, even though that means that you can leave your home to conduct business for real estate transactions, please stay home in every opportunity you possibly can. Use this as a chance to make virtual showings, do a virtual open house, connect with your clients on Zoom. This is a great resource, or other virtual platforms, FaceTime. You've got all sorts of options nowadays to connect with people virtually. They deemed us an essential business not because the health crisis has lessened in any way. In fact, it's getting worse. They deemed us an essential business because there are certain transactions that weave into the fabric of our economy that we cannot stop, and we think real estate is one of those. If this gets so far out of control, they may rethink that assignment. They may say too many realtors are out there, too many people are having showings and not following the guidelines and not doing everything they possibly can virtually. And so they could back it up if they find that real estate sales is a source of spread for coronavirus. So why I say that is to just remind everybody that even though we are deemed an essential business right now, it is so important that anything you can do from your home, please do from your home, and use this as an opportunity to connect with people virtually, and only to do showings when absolutely necessary. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you are doing a showing, everybody has to be on board. If your buyer is the one who wants to inspect the property during the inspection period, which I understand why they would want to, and a seller refuses access and says, I am not willing to let people through my home, then you need to understand that the seller will likely have the prerogative to not allow people into their home. This brings me to kind of a second area that I want to talk to, which are the new forms that CAR just came out with. As of when I looked yesterday, some of them were not on zip forms yet, so you'd have to go onto the CAR website to download them. But they are available for download and for use immediately. And there are 4 forms that they put out directly related to the coronavirus. The first thing I'd like to say is please talk to your broker and your transaction department to figure out how they're applying the forms. As you guys know, I'm general counsel for RE/MAX Estate Properties. And so I've set out some guidelines for our agents and some very clear pathways for them to use the form, as well as some internal frequently asked questions so they understand how to use it. I encourage each of you to talk to your brokers, talk to your managers, and figure out within your companies how they plan on using the forms and how they want you to fill everything out and when to use them. The reason those 4 forms are really important, and in particular they're the last 2 that just came out, it's the PEAD and the RLACA. The RLACA is an amendment or an addendum to a listing contract. Really quickly, a question I get is, what is the difference between an amendment and an addendum? An addendum is something you add on while you're creating a contract. So it's just like an extra page to a contract that you're in the process of creating. What is an amendment? An amendment is a document you use to change an existing contract. So if you already have a listing agreement in place and you want to put in this amendment, you would be amending it because your listing agreement is already in place. If, on the other hand, you are in the process of creating a new listing agreement and you want to add this on, it becomes an addendum. So the reason they called it that is to really account for both circumstances, for people who want to put it in when they're first signing the listing, or for people when they are already have a listing and what they want to do is add it to it. So I want to talk for a moment about that form. The RLACAA, that is, I'm opening it up on my computer so I can take a look at it as I talk to you guys. That stands for the Listing Agreement Coronavirus Addendum or Amendment. I actually really like this form, and the reason I like this form, even if your client is unwilling to sign it, which I know happens sometimes, hopefully they do sign it, but even if your client isn't willing to sign it, because it is such a great talking point for issues that are going to arise during the listing in this coronavirus period. it talks about what is acceptable activity. I highly encourage, by the way, if you can get this form signed by your clients with listings, do it. It talks about virtual marketing versus and signage and visual inspections and showings and putting up fumigation tents for termite work, stuff that we all kind of took for granted a couple of weeks ago that were just part and parcel to a real estate transaction. Of course you had a showing. Of course, if there's termite work, you have the termite company intent. And of course you do A, B, C, and D. And the people who kind of held back on those traditional transactional experiences, that was the that was the exception, not the rule. Now it's flipped. Now the rule is nobody come, with very few exceptions. So what I really like about this form is that it has the opportunity for you to have a conversation with your client about what's going to be acceptable and what's not going to be acceptable during the entire listing period with respect to all of these things that we used to just take as a given. So take a look at that form. Again, I don't know if it's on Zip Forms yet because I haven't looked since yesterday when it came out, but it is definitely on the CAR website. The other form that just came out that I think is really important to talk about is the PEAD. That's the Coronavirus Property Entry Advisory and Declaration. That sounds like that's a mouthful. But really what it is it's making people aware in writing that they have risks of exposure for coronavirus, or they or anybody is visiting a property for any reason during this time. And again, these forms, you know, fingers crossed, are very temporary to help us through this crisis. But what that form is doing is it's letting people know about exposure. I mean, I would assume anyone who's watching the news has some sense of what's happening. But it really helps people understand that there are stay-at-home orders, that we are an essential service, but we still are trying to do everything to follow guidelines and do everything virtually that we possibly can, but that you understand, either buyer, seller, landlord, tenant, occupant, you understand people who are entering a property or allowing other people to enter your property, that there are risks involved. Even though this is an essential service, there are still risks involved. And if you are visiting properties or you are allowing other people to visit your property, you are taking on risk. Is this going to be a catch-all, no one can touch me form? No, no form is that good. If forms were that good, we would never have conversation, we just speak in forms. But it really does a better job than nothing. And it gives people the opportunity to say, I'm weighing and balancing the risk. Do I want to do the showing? Do I want to let people in? And if you have a buyer, seller, landlord, tenant, or occupant who is going to be visiting a property for any reason, or having people visit a property for any reason, then I recommend you get this form signed. I get questions about, can multiple parties sign the same form? Quite frankly, if people are signing the form, keep the form in your transaction file. It's going to be hopefully helpful for you going forward. And then the other two forms that are not brand new, but the CVA was revised. That's the Coronavirus Addendum and Amendment. Again, that difference between addendum and amendment, they wanted to account for both circumstances. It was revised, and the revisions are substantial revisions. In my opinion, it has the same purpose and intent as the first version of the Coronavirus Addendum Amendment, but the way it goes about executing it is so different. So if you feel comfortable with the first version, and so you start using the second one thinking it's the same, it's not. So read the second one, really get to know it, understand what it means, and what the different options are for your clients. The NUCC, which is the fourth form that came out in the last couple days, I'm going to open that one up really quickly. It's the Notice of Unforeseen Coronavirus Circumstances. So when do you use this form? This form is only used when you have the CVA, the Coronavirus Addendum, already in place. Now remember that Coronavirus Addendum is entirely optional between the parties. It's negotiated. You cannot force anyone to sign it. But if you do have it signed, and again, that's going to be a question of your leverage in the transaction, your negotiating power in the transaction, which also translates to the willingness of the buyers and the sellers to accept certain terms, right? We go through this all the time. We go through it with COPs, we go through it with SPRPs, we go through it with how long your inspection contingency is, we go through all sorts of different things where we negotiate. What is a buyer willing to put forward in order to buy the property? What is the seller willing to accept in order to sell a property? So that's what I mean when I say that it's going to be a matter of negotiation, of leverage. If you have a buyer who is adamant about having a CVA and a seller who says, absolutely not, I'm not going to allow it, you may not have a deal. But if you have a seller who understands, maybe every buyer I'm going to meet is going to have a CVA, or in order for me to find a buyer without a CVA, I might take less money. And those are all decisions and things that the sellers and the buyers are going to need to discuss as the market shifts and changes. So what the NUCC is, the Notice of Unforeseen Circumstances is it's not a form you just get to hand somebody and say, oh, unforeseen circumstances, here you go, I'm out. No, it's a form that you use in conjunction with the CVA. So if you have a CVA in place, the new CVA, in order to get it started really, in order to push the start button on the CVA that you've already signed, you have to give them the Notice of Unforeseen Corona Circumstances. Once you give them to that, and once you deliver it, then the terms of the CVA are going to apply. So that one, take a look at the revisions, because I know it was a little confusing at first on how they revised it. In my opinion, it was a substantial revision. I think they revised it for the better. I know they were under the gun trying to get it out as quickly as possible, but no, the CVA and the NUCC are tied together. They're not really separate forms. So the CVA, I think there was a question of when was it revised. I think it was revised on Monday. So today's Thursday. All right, we're all going through what day of the week is it. Today's Thursday. It was either revised on Monday or Tuesday, but it was revised very recently. And it was revised when the NUCC came out. So those forms, take a look at them. They are geared specifically for coronavirus circumstances, and they will give you an opportunity to mold and move your transaction the best you can. And I highly encourage you guys to talk to your brokers, talk to your managers, and figure out how they want you to use the form, if they're mandatory. I know we have made certain ones mandatory, others not, to help protect our agents. But that's going to be a decision that each broker is going to need to make on their own. So that's what I wanted to talk about as far as the new forms go. The other thing I want to mention is that CAR has a fantastic website. If you guys have not followed it, go to CAR's website. They have one that's dedicated to coronavirus. The actual site is carcovidupdates.org. That's carcovidupdates with an S.org. And they're giving nearly daily updates because, quite frankly, that's what it's taking right now to make sure everybody stays up to date about what's going on. And on there, you'll find the new forms that they've released, as well as weekly newsletters and guidelines and frequently asked questions. So all of that is going to help you navigate through this. If you don't have, I know for our agents, I send out a lot of stuff on a daily basis, but if you don't have that, CVR is going to be a fantastic resource for you. And I know in the very beginning of all of this, it felt a little, I heard feedback that it felt a little politicized by them saying, no, we're not an essential business. And quite frankly, they read the law, and there was no exception at the time in California for real estate. So it's really trying to provide you with a down and dirty, here's what's happening, here's what's changed in the last day, and here's how you can accommodate those changes in your business. So one of the things also that I want to kind of address is dealing with buyers and sellers in this market. And it's changing weekly. I think as buyers and sellers are getting more accustomed to the idea that this is a very serious problem that's hitting the United States. We have had $3.3 million claims for unemployment. Last week, 6.6 million claims. They're the highest claims that by 5 and then now 10-fold that we've ever had in the history of recording those numbers. And so I think it's starting to hit home that this is much more serious than some people initially thought. So we were having folks who said, well, I'm losing out listings because I'm not showing the property when it was a non-essential business. And in reality, what's happening is our folks are adapting, folks who are going virtual, creating virtual home tours, virtual showings, and on the very few circumstances when you really need to show a property, now that it's allowed, they're doing it. They're faring very well because buyers and sellers are watching the news too, and regardless of what they think politically about what's happening, from a health, safety, and welfare perspective, they want to keep people safe, and so they're looking to you for creative ways to figure out how to market a property and show a property and sell a property in today's environment. I honestly think that virtual was the way everything was going. Videos hit. I think their click-through rate is exponentially higher than photos or just a text printing online. What this has done is it has put the business into warp speed towards being virtual. The fact that we're doing a webinar from my office and that you're all able to join and get information this way is incredible. And it is going to, I think, change. There will be a lot of life that will go back to normal and how it was, but there will be a lot of other aspects to, especially real estate, that I think will be taken from this, including really moving virtually, allowing access to information, access to property, access to insides, virtual tours that will allow people to head into the virtual world. So that was what was on my mind. Nikki, did you have any specific questions or areas that you wanted me to kind of touch upon that I haven't talked about so far?
I mean, no, I think that's great. So I think if you want to start taking questions, there's some in the Q&A, and then if anyone else has questions, go ahead and add them in there, and Melanie can get to them.
Okay, great. So bear with me while I scroll down in your guys' chat.
So if you go into the Q&A, you'll see them. There's 6 of them in there.
There's a Q&A or the chat?
And the Q&A.
Oh,
yeah, so the first one is from Deanna. Where would we find the city definition?
Oh, I just found them. Okay, great. So I'm in your Q&A. Thank you, guys. Where would we find the city definition? So you're going to have to look in the city websites. So the city of Los Angeles, for example, says a whole host of things that they deem essential. And last time I checked, real estate sales was not on there. In fact, it has the exact same sentence as the county order does, except it stops before it ever talks about real estate and settlement services and things like that. Settlement services have a much stronger argument about being in the financial sector. Real estate sales, it excludes it. So you're going to go look on your city's website. Every city that I have found, with the exception of one small city, has a coronavirus website. So if you check out the city's website, look for a COVID link. They usually have their own site that they've set up. If they have orders about these issues, they should be published in the city's website. Many cities have no orders. If the city has no order, then you just get to follow the county that you're in. If the county has no order, there are still some counties in California that have not issued their own orders. If that's the case, then you follow the state. And just keep in mind, the state allows real estate to be an essential business, as well as the county of Los Angeles. Don't take that, please, as a carte blanche, go back to business as usual. I can't stress this enough. It's still a time to do every single thing you possibly can from your home and virtually. And the only things that you should be attending properties for are things that are entirely necessary. And in that case, please take the proper steps to make it safe. I know Nikki in the chat, which I was confusing at first for the Q&A, and Nikki in the chat has put some great links. Risk management, how to do inspections, best practices, guidelines. All of those websites are really helpful and answer a lot of your questions about how to do those things if you have to. Will you be able to list all of those new forms, or does CAR list them on their website so we know what's new? So I will put here in the chat right now the new forms. This is the CVA, the NUCC, the PEAD, and the RLACAA. Those are the 4 new forms. And I will go ahead and put the coronavirus update link in here right underneath those forms. So that's all in the chat. So if you stick the chat, you'll see I just put all of that information in there. And in the coronavirus updates page, if you scroll down, you'll see CAR puts the forms directly linked in their website. So on March 31st, you'll find the PEAD and the RLA. And then if you scroll down a little bit further, you'll find the, the CVA and the NUCC, I think, are on zip forms already. So next question. So if we already had showings, inspections, etc., should we now send out these forms to buyers, sellers, agents to sign after the fact? After the fact, I don't think it's going to help you much at all. It's one of those circumstances where it may actually point to a concern that you have liability, when it's really questionable whether you would be seen as the causation of all of this, as the cause of all of this. So if you've already done showings, oh, I just sent it to the panelists. I see Nikki, sorry, Nikki is putting it out to everybody, so that'll be there shortly. So if you've already done showings and inspections, I do not recommend that you give them the PEAD now. I think that ship has sailed. What are some best practices for real estate offices? Should real estate offices stay closed and only keep essential employees like accounting and escrow? My personal opinion is yes. My personal opinion is that real estate offices should remain closed. We have closed our offices at RE/MAX Estate Properties. We have 15 offices. Those are closed. Escrow services are open, but escrow services, which is an affiliated business, for Peninsula Escrow is one of our affiliated businesses. Their offices are open, but they're closed to the public. So nobody is permitted in the office other than the officers and their employees. And within the office, they have set things up so that they are keeping distances between one another and making sure there's a sanitation protocol for each of those offices. But as far as the real estate offices are concerned, I do recommend that they be closed, in particular because you don't have any understanding or control of the wave of people coming in and out. So what we've asked our folks to do, our employees are no longer in the offices. Many of them are working from home. But what we have asked the agents to do is stay out of the offices unless there's something that's absolutely urgent that they need to collect from their desk. Go in, get the item, sanitize everything you've touched, and to please leave. You know, we're so able to have offices from our house now that has not become too great of a burden. So the California Association, I know, is also closed. The idea would be don't go into an office unless you really have no other option, and make your office at home. I have a listing coming out in the city of Los Angeles. I understand the city has stricter guidelines like no in-person showings and no open houses. If the house is vacant, can I send a stager as well as a photographer? That's a great question. There's two questions in there that I want to address. I know you asked it as one, but there's really two issues. Number one issue is the house is vacant. Does that matter? The guidelines make no distinction between vacant homes and occupied homes. None. They say nothing about real estate sales for occupied properties are not essential, but vacant properties are essential. They don't make that distinction. There's no delineation there. So under the order, vacant homes treated the same way as occupied homes. So in the city of Los Angeles, that would not be an exception. Now, practically speaking, you're probably safer in a vacant home than you are in a grocery store, but that's not what the law says. And as more and more people are getting sick, we started by a lot of cities saying we're not going to enforce it, we're not going to arrest people, we're not going to fine people, to where we are now, where people are getting arrested and people are getting fined for violating these orders because it has become such a significant health risk. So vacant homes, no different than occupied homes. So if there is a non-essential business in a specific city, a vacant home cannot be shown, staged or whatnot. The second part of that question is, can I have stagers and inspectors come in? Let's say because we're deemed essential in a particular city. I am an essential service in the city of Palos Verdes. Can I have a photographer or a stager come in? Well, that is a question for the stager and the inspector. The stagers, the inspectors, the photographers, the videographers, they have to make their own determination about whether they are an essential business. Just because you are an essential business does not make somebody else an essential business. So one of the things they're really going to have to ask themselves, and quite frankly their legal counsel, is whether they are deemed an essential business themselves. Do they fall truly within the real estate service category, or is there something else? So if you have a stager, photographer, or videographer who's coming into the house, I would absolutely have them sign one of those PEADs so that they understand their responsibility and liability through all of this. Are we allowed to share CAR's website with our clients? CAR's general update website is public. Any website that's public, absolutely share with your clients. They can look through it. It's got great resources. Also can take some of the heat off of you, so none of them feel like you're the one making these rules, that these guidelines are coming down from the state of California through CAR to you after they've been vetted by a team of attorneys. I mean, they have a team up there. I've spoken to them a couple of times about these issues. So absolutely, the part that you won't be able to get to your clients is when it links you over to Zip Forms or Win Forms or any of those websites. But the general updates, please send to your clients. To clarify what determines the city rules you have to follow, where your office is or where the property is. For example, your office could be in LA, but your listing is in Redondo. Are you essential? Then reverse, office is in Redondo, listing is in LA. That is a great question. And it's quite possible that it could come out where you're having to follow both. I would imagine, I actually don't know the answer to that question outright. Here's the problem, and here's what's going through my head right now, is you tend to have a business license in the city in which you're doing business. And when you have a business license in a city, you're agreeing to abide by the rules of that city. Well, if you're having a listing in Redondo and selling, and that's a city that requires a business license, well, then you're also doing business in Redondo at that time. What I would do as a realtor, having thought through that question, is I would follow the rules where the property is located. Absolutely. Absolutely follow the rules where the property is located. Because in particular, I think that's where you're going to have fines. That's where you're going to have more liability as far as people who are breaking an order in an area where you're not allowed to do showings. So I tend to fall on the side of where the property is located. But you know, what's interesting about this is these are going to be a lot of cases of first impression. We as lawyers make our determinations based on a couple of things. One is what we understand the general principles of the law to be. And the other one is precedent. What have courts decided? How have they interpreted the law when they've had circumstances that are strange and people end up in lawsuits? How has a court interpreted a law? It takes years for that to happen. The reason it takes years, I'll go off on a really quick tangent. The reason it takes years is because in order to get a case that an attorney can read and rely upon, first there has to be a lawsuit. That lawsuit goes to and through trial. There has to be a judgment. That judgment has to be appealed to a higher court. The Court of Appeals has to agree to hear that case. And then they have to issue a ruling that they agree will be published about that case. That can take 4 years sometimes. So how all of these coronavirus issues, liability, causation, people getting sick, people misunderstanding the rule or misinterpreting things or just blatantly defying them, how all of that's really going to play out, any lawyer who tells you that this is how it's going to play out has no clue. The truth is that we will see likely a flurry of lawsuits. So I would follow the place that the property is located, but quite frankly, to know for certain how that's going to play out, we won't know for a very long time. What's the ruling for LA County and Orange County? LA County, we are an essential business. Orange County, I don't do any work in Orange County, so I don't know. So I would check the county's website. If they have an order, follow it. If they have no order, then you're going to follow the state, which says we're an essential business. Perhaps irrelevant to the new and revised COVID form, tenants whose livelihood have been impacted by the coronavirus are exempt from paying rent. How about landlords? Are they able to be compensated for the rent losses as well as ongoing operating expenses? So it is not addressed. Tenants and landlords are not addressed in the coronavirus addendum. That is not for leases. That is just for purchases and sales. So how does coronavirus affect landlords and tenants? That's a great question. There have been orders issued both federally and then much more strict on a state level for residential tenants. But on a federal level, there is a moratorium. What is a moratorium? It's hitting the pause button. There's a pause button on residential and commercial evictions as well as foreclosures for certain properties. What is that, certain properties? I don't remember the list off the top of my head, but the biggest one that comes to mind is if it is a, if there is a mortgage backed by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, some federal funding backed mortgage, then that property has a moratorium on it for evictions as well as foreclosures. If you're a tenant, how do you know whether you qualify? It's very gray to me. I think you'd have to ask, and it has complications and issues. The state's order is much more specific, and it's geared towards residential tenancies. And what the state says is that if a tenant is unable to pay rent or unable to move, for example, due to coronavirus, then you cannot evict them. There is also an opportunity to have rent deferrals. I want to be clear, you do not have to waive the rent. The rent will still be owed and due. It just can be deferred until after the coronavirus emergency legislation and emergency orders are lifted. Now, I get questions about, isn't that going to cause a huge wave of foreclosures after and evictions after? And the answer is yes, which is why I do think the government will also intervene at that point. There's been talk about 6 months. The latest I heard was 12-month period in order for tenants to pay back the deferred rent. We're anticipating the months likely of April and May. And so all of that is going to kind of flush out in the coming months. A question that I was asked not too long ago was, can I evict a tenant for non-coronavirus related issues? And the answer is yes, but courts are relatively closed. They have closed for all non-emergency issues. So they're still hearing temporary restraining orders in certain criminal cases that deal with people's constitutional rights and domestic violence issues, child issues. They're still hearing all of those cases because they consider those emergencies. But if you have a contract dispute, then you're going to be pushed to the back of the line and they're not allowing you to come to the courtroom. So, what I think is the best practice at this point, if you have a tenant who's struggling to pay for whatever reason, is to talk to them and discuss with them, what can you pay? Because if you continue to pay even the maximum that you're able to pay right now, then when you do finally have to, when it all comes due, when the bill comes due, then you're not so far behind that you're then gonna get evicted at the end of it. As far as commercial leases go, a lot of that's negotiable. Landlords can't evict you, but if you default, you're in a much better position if you can agree upon a deferral with a commercial landlord. Residential is far more strict. Is the PEAD good for leases too? No, it is only for purchases. It's not for leases. So for leases, don't forget, I know this was old news, but don't forget that we now have statewide rent control. And so for all leases that are going into effect, you need to have the RCJC, which is the Rent Control and Just Cause Addendum, attached to all leases. And if you have leases that were in place before, you still need to reach out to those landlords you represented or those tenants you represented and provide those RCJCs, because every lease in California is going to need those within the next few months. I know we kind of got away from rent control, but it's still very much there, and it's going to be impactful on the leases that you're writing now for when all of this is over. So that was all of the questions. I saw a question or comment about the relief stimulus package. Absolutely. So the $2 trillion stimulus package, known as the CARES Act, C-A-R-E-S. I'm not going to try and remember what that means, but it is the stimulus package that the government has signed. And a lot of those funding, I know the PPP, which is the Payroll Protection Plan, goes into effect this Friday, and so applications are starting tomorrow. There are opportunities for independent contractors, meaning you, realtors, to get unemployment benefits. There's increased unemployment payments in that stimulus package, as well as we've all heard those checks that are coming out to individuals who make under a certain amount based on their tax returns. So if you want more information about that, the website that I gave you, the carcovidupdates.org, has a lot of information about that on their website. And they also have a phone number that you can call during normal business hours to discuss whether the Relief Act can help you as an independent contractor, as a realtor, and what you might be eligible for. So they can give you advice on that. But these are all packages. Everything in the stimulus package is worthwhile looking into, if for no other reason than you may be eligible for something to make sure your business can really stay afloat during this period of time, and to take advantage of the opportunities. So those were all the questions. Nikki, anything else I'm missing?
No, I think that's good, and we will be posting it up on our YouTube channel, the recording, hopefully later today.
Great. There was one question that we got.
Oh yeah.
Eviction moratorium for all properties in California, including single family. Yeah, it just delineates between residential and commercial. So any residential properties is included in the eviction moratorium. Again, one of the biggest issues is you're not going to be able to get in front of an eviction judge until all of this is over, most likely, as far as I have heard.
Great, thank you, Melanie, and thank you everybody for being on the webinar, and hopefully we'll get to do another one maybe next week or so. Thanks again, Melanie. Oh wait, it looks like we do have 2 more questions. Do you see them on there?
I do.
All right.
Does the eviction issue apply to someone that lives in my house? They definitely have not gone into those kinds of specifics. If you have a roommate problem, you may still be able to follow the process. I don't know. What I would do in that circumstance is reach out to a landlord-tenant attorney who specializes in evictions. I know they're still working from home. They're taking questions, and they can help you through that process. And so if you have someone who lives in your home or roommate, I would absolutely reach out to a landlord-tenant attorney who specializes in it. It's on new listing, still saying able to show. You know, technically you can show the listings. So we are an essential business. If you think there's been a violation of any of the MLS rules, then you need to report that to the CRMLS, but they are allowed to show. What you can't do not do open houses, brokers opens, anything like that. If you need to do a showing, you are allowed to do a showing because we are an essential business. But again, get the PEAD sign, and please don't do it unless you have to. Is a 60-day notice considered an eviction? Eviction is a catch-all term for anytime you're asking a tenant to leave, anytime you're asking them to leave. So in theory, you could provide a 60-day notice if you're allowed to under the rent control rules. Let's say you're allowed to, and you provide a 60-day notice. In theory, it's fine, but one of the bigger questions happens is when that 60 days expires, are we still under these orders? Are you still restricted from actually doing anything about that 60-day notice? Or do you just have to keep letting them live there? I think that was it.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Great. Thank you guys for joining. Good luck. Be safe. I wish everybody health, and until next time.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, everybody.